Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a very special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation of just how hard it is to make a film, and just me being very, very grateful that films somehow are made. Now, what you've happened upon here is one of my occasional special episodes of the podcast where I invite a filmmaker on to talk about a particular film or their body of work. And in this case, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast writer and director Phil Alden Robinson. Now, previously, we talked about my favourite film of all time, Field of Dreams, that Phil Alden Robinson wrote and directed, adapting the book Shoeless Joe for that one. That's back in the archive somewhere. But we're turning our attention now to 2002's The Sum of All Fears. Now, this was a sort of soft reboot of the Jack Ryan movie series that to that point had featured 1990's The Hunt for Red October, 1992's Patriot Games, 1994's Clear and Present Danger. And for a long time, The Sum of All Fears was going to be the third Harrison Ford Jack Ryan film until Paramount Pictures went in a slightly different direction. Now, it's based on the book by Tom Clancy, stars Ben Affleck, Morgan Freeman, and a screenplay to this written by Paul Attanasio and Daniel Pine. And this is going to be an extensive chat you hear with Phil Alden Robinson, where we talk about the film and his path to it. There are a couple of little references to other films that pop up throughout this. For instance, at one stage, I just drop in the name of a film, Lord of War, which is a terrific movie starring Nicolas Cage. I really urge you to seek out. We talk about the children's author Roald Dahl at one point as well. The Ed Zwick's film Glory from 1989, I think that comes up at one point. And also we weave in discussion about another Phil Alden Robinson film, Sneakers, a real favourite of mine, that as well, from 1992. And so those are, I think, the bits you need to know going into this conversation to get the most out of it. It's a good, long, in-depth chat, this. I'm hugely grateful to Phil Alden Robinson for his time again on this podcast. What I'm going to do, I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer of The Sum of All Fears, and then we'll go straight into my conversation with him after that.
Hello, Kathy.
I can't make it tonight.
Where are you going?
I can't tell you that.
Jack, tell her where you're going. In fact, tell her who you work for. She'll be impressed.
I work for the CIA, and the director asked me at the last minute to come with him to Russia to do a nuclear arms inspection.
That is so lame.
Hello?
You're about to breathe air that's way over your pay grade, so listen up. You're going to be asked for analysis and advice, so be sure you know what you're talking about. Welcome to the CIA, sport.
At a time of increasing tension.
According to this, there are 17 senior scientists on duty today.
I only count 14.
Deliberate deception.
3 Russian scientists are missing. I need to know where they are.
Shut up. I don't go on the missions.
I just write reports.
So write a report about it.
I'm an analyst. I'm not trained for this.
Just be my eyes and ears.
I can't be with somebody who's going to keep their life.
So that then was a clip from 2002's The Sum of All Fears, and I'm delighted to be joined on this podcast yet again by the director of the greatest film of all time. Well, that's not the greatest intro to that, because the greatest film of all time, with all due respect to you, Phil Alden Robinson, is not The Sum of All Fears. It is, of course, Field of Dreams, but we've covered that before. But a very warm welcome to you nonetheless.
Thank you, and back at you. I'm happy to talk to you as always.
Before I get to the film, I just wonder, because we've had conversations in the past about Field of Dreams, and we've had conversations about Sneakers as well, two films very, very, very dear to my heart, and I'm a huge fan of The Sum of All Fears as well. But there was a gap in the middle of those two films, part filled by Band of Brothers, But also, I got a memory, and I've looked high and low of reading an article about you in Premiere magazine about some work you were doing in Sarajevo around that time. And I'm just wondering where that fits in the chronology.
After Sneakers, which came out in '92,
Good film, that.
I was invited. I took a year off, and I just wanted to have a life. And I was invited by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to go with them as an observer on a relief mission to Somalia,
Oh, good grief.
and then to Bosnia. And I just said, okay. I didn't know much about either place, and it sounded interesting, and it sounded like kind of what I wanted, which was to kind of shake up my life a little bit.
Yeah.
And I went out and bought a video camera, and I just shot, in both these places, and really fell in love with Sarajevo. The war was about 6 months old at the time,
Yeah.
and I saw a production of the musical Hair in the midst of shelling and sniping and whatnot, and I really it began a long relationship with the city and some of the people that I met there. And when I came back, I edited the tapes, and I did a series of documentaries for ABC Nightline, which was an evening news show. And I went back to Sarajevo less than a year later to sort of follow up on some of the things I got involved with some people's lives and tried to get them out, and I got a few people out. But it was just a fascinating, life-changing experience. And that was a couple of years, almost full time, of just getting involved in all of that. And then I started to write. I wrote something that became a TV movie called Freedom Song. It was stories based on the civil rights movement, and I spent years going down to Mississippi and getting these stories and meeting the people who lived them, and that took years. So I was very busy. I just didn't have anything, getting produced until I think '99. We shot Freedom Song, and the following year, the first episode of Band of Brothers, and then the year after that, Sum of All Fears.
So at the point, because I mean, I'm a huge fan of All of Me as well. But if we go back to the person who was writing like Rhinestone and All of Me, was there any part of you and the upbringing that you came from that you could even perceive that you would get a tap on the shoulder from the UN?
No, well, except I was a political science major in college.
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated by politics and what's happening in the world. So I'd always maintained a very strong interest in that. And so when the UN said, "Do you want to go?" it was a no-brainer for me. It's like, I want to go, and I want to see what's happening. And the situation in Sarajevo really just touched me so much when getting to know these people and being with them. The city was surrounded and it was under siege, and it was I had a flak vest and I had a passport to get me out, unlike the people who were stuck there. But I got very, very involved with some of them in particular, and still am. I mean, I'm still quite good friends with quite a few people I met there. It was a fascinating situation that I think people here didn't really understand, because the media kept talking about, oh, well, there's Catholics and there's Christians and there's Serbs and there's Croats and they hate each other and they've always been fighting for 500 years. And none of that was true. They weren't fighting for 500 years. The war had nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
It was purely about power and about land grabs. And extreme nationalists using the media round the clock to stir up ancient hatreds and to stir up anger and frustrations and channel it into extremist nationalist politics.
I mean, coming back from Sarajevo, was it ever conceivable to you that you wouldn't return to filmmaking? Because presumably that's life-changing, what you went through there.
It didn't occur to me. No, I thought that my role would be to sort of use filmmaking somehow, and I was able to do it with these documentaries for Nightline. I also spent a couple of years writing a screenplay called Age of Aquarius about.
I've heard of that.
About Sarajevo.
Yeah.
That we almost got made. We came very close. We were in pre-production, and the star changed his mind, and but that would have been. I think that would have been the best thing I'd done.
And is it one of those that just its moment has gone? Because you've talked in the past that you've got a collection of scripts in the drawer that you're going to give me free of charge. I think that's what you said. Then I'll just rub your name off.
Every screenwriter has a drawer full of stuff that they all think, well, this is the best thing I've ever done. I mean, I've got a couple that I think are better than what I got produced, but just it's a crapshoot. You never know from day to day what the town wants, and can you fill that need at that moment.
Because I mean, the other story I got around the time is you did a bit of work on the Chamber, and I don't know if there's anything to that, but the Chamber was one that popped up in a William Goldman book, if memory serves, about him not having the best of times on that one either. And
Most people didn't.
Say again, sorry.
Most people didn't.
Right, but you were involved in that because I think it's a pseudonym on that. So I appreciate you probably don't want to talk too much about it.
A little bit, but I will say that I talked to Bill Goldman when I started, and it was the first time I'd ever met him, and he was a great gentleman and so smart, and he cared so deeply. He's one of my screenwriting heroes. I mean, clearly he's one of the best who's ever picked up a pen. So in that respect, the experience was good for me in that I got to meet Bill Goldman.
Yeah. Is it in his Princess Bride script? It says something like, "This is the second best sword fight ever in the movies." And then about 30 pages later, it says, "Now this is the best sword fight ever in movies." I think that was right. I'm going to edit that out if I'm wrong, because otherwise I'll sound silly. But yeah.
Sounds like it.
And so the point where because you said you did Freedom Song, but then Band of Brothers, I mean, one of the things that comes across in your work is this is an outsider looking in. You don't repeat yourself, and B, there's generally a reasonable amount of gestation time between your projects, and then these, particularly the film we're going to come talk to in a minute, but these started coming a little bit thick and fast. That there was a little run that you went from Freedom Song, that you went on to Band of Brothers, which every father has had that as a Father's Day present on DVD at some point. Right. I think that's the law. Extraordinary series. And then you went on to The Sum of All Fears. And was that just a confluence of things coming together or a deliberate push?
It was absolutely a confluence. I like taking time and thinking about things and writing them, so to take time to do that. Band of Brothers happened because Steven Spielberg was going to direct the first episode, and he had a scheduling conflict. Right. And they were already prepping, and they called me and said, I was in New York meeting on another project that never happened, and my agent said, are you interested in directing the first episode of Band of Brothers? I said, sure, I'd heard of it. And he said, well, you got to meet with Stephen and Tom Hanks. I said, I'm in New York, I'm coming home tomorrow. I said, well, when you get home, go from the airport to Tom's office. So that told me this was a little bit accelerated. Yeah. And I went to Tom's office, and there he was with Stephen. And I walked in thinking that this was going to be are you interested? And Stephen said, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know that I have just signed on. Yeah. And I said, well, it's a pleasure. And they said, how soon can you go to London? I said, I just got home, so give me a week or so. And they said, no, can you leave tonight or tomorrow morning? And I said, I can't leave tonight. So I left the next day. I was on a plane to London, and they had been prepping for a couple of weeks without a director. I've never been greeted so warmly by a crew, because they desperately needed someone to say, here's how we're doing this. And we prepped very quickly and then shot, and it was a really terrific experience.
But I don't know whether, again, it's my perception or not, but if that had been offered to you and you'd had 3-4 months to think about it, would the answer likely have been different?
No, I think I was interested in that. I'm a World War II buff a little bit, and I like the idea, as you say, of doing something I haven't done before. That's always been one of the prime motivators for me, because when I'm challenged, when I feel like I'm in over my head, I don't really know how to do this, I think that's when I dig deeper and do better work. Yeah. When I walk into a project thinking, oh man, this is right in my wheelhouse, I know exactly how to do this, I think I get lazy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're lazy. It's very good. I'll give you that. I mean, were you close? I read it again. I mean, I'm just coming back to the fact that you talked about politics at college, which again is going to thread into the chat about The Sum of All Fears. But I might be recalling this incorrectly. But were you in conversation on 13 Days around that time as well?
Yes, that was a little earlier. Yeah. I was in conversation about that. And had differences of opinion about where the script should go. So we all parted amicably and moved on.
Yeah, I'm not after the stories of the punch-ups. You can save that for afterwards when we're in the pub.
I don't have any.
No, I'll just make them up. It's the internet. This is the new way of working. You must have worked this
That's a
out.
good point. Oh, we're going to come across a few of those in Some of All Fears.
Well, I mean, shall we talk Tom Clancy? I mean
Sure.
that's the reason I come to Tom Clancy before we come specifically to the film is I dug quite a lot into the film Patriot Games at one point, where his level of dissatisfaction was such that he didn't want his name on the poster, that the filmmakers, I think it's pretty much on record, were not particularly enamored of some of the communications they were getting from him. And conversely, Tom Clancy was fairly forceful in what he liked in terms of the interpretation of his books. And I remember too, when they were doing The Hunt for Red October, of having to go and visit his compound, was it? I mean, there's some kind of setup that he had to get, and just this kind of intimidating conversation with an author. And by the sounds of it, your relationship was slightly better.
It was great, but it came about. You've set it up perfectly. He was very unhappy after. I think Patriot Games was the one before Some of All Fears.
Clear and present danger for it. Patriot Games. Yeah,
that's right. He was pretty unhappy with everybody at that point.
Yeah.
And when I signed on to Some of All Fears, which was a very quick process,
yes.
Sherry Lansing, who was chairman of Paramount Pictures, said to me, I said to her, I should probably call Clancy. She said, do not talk to Tom Clancy. He hates us. He hates the script. He doesn't like the producers anymore, who he used to like. Do not talk to him. And I felt bad.
Yeah.
We started shooting. I was about 2 weeks into photography, and Sherry called me one night in Montreal, and she said, sweetie, Tom Clancy hates the script, and I told him you'd call him. Here's his number. So I called him up, and he said, yeah, thanks for calling. He says, listen, there's a lot of crap in the script, and you got to change all this stuff, and it's horrible. And I said, well, I've already started shooting, but I'd love to get your notes. And he said, well, I've written a memo. I'll send you the memo. Give me your email address. And he sends me this email that was so angry and inflammatory and nasty and very, very scatological that it was like it was burned. It was smoke was coming out of my laptop. And I was only halfway through reading it when he called me. And he said, did you get my memo? I said, yeah. And he said, pretty inflammatory, isn't it? I said, that's okay. It's all right. And that's all he wanted to hear. I didn't fight back. And he was insulting things that I had written in there. I just said, all right, let's talk. I think that's all he ever wanted, was to be taken seriously and to engage. So I said to him, there's a lot of things in here that I agree with, but I've already shot and I can't change. And there are things in here that I don't agree with and I don't want to change. And there are things in here that I haven't shot and I do agree with and I will change. And I said, I'll respond to your memo in detail and I'll send it back to you. He said, that's all I ask. So I did that, and then we were pals. And we had many, many long, really long conversations at night when I needed to sleep. He would call me from Baltimore and say, hey, did I ever tell you the time that I... And they were fascinating. He was a really, really interesting, complex guy. And we had great talks. We agreed on nothing in politics. He was really a conservative Republican. They were respectful conversations. They were interesting conversations. I think he just liked the fact that I didn't have a knee-jerk, don't talk to me, I'm a filmmaker, I know better. When it was time to premiere the film, we decided we were going to do it in Washington, D.C. as a benefit for one of his charities. So he would be honored with that. And I called him up and I said, hey, I have to do a narration for the DVD. And these things are always these boring love fests where filmmakers talk about, then I thought of this idea and this was brilliant and here's how I solved this problem. I said, I'm going to do one of those, but I also would like to do one with you where you can say everything that you disagree with about this movie.
And he did.
And he said, he said, they'll never use that. I said, I promise you they will. It'll be great. And I'll just interview you. I'll pretend I'm an interviewer, not the... So we went and he came in loaded for bear. He started off by saying, "I'm Tom Clancy. I'm the guy whose book Phil ignored."
It is one of the most killer opening lines of any DVD commentary, isn't it?
It was great. And at that point, I knew, okay, this is going to be an interesting ride. And the trick for me was don't fight.
Yeah.
Just interview the man. Just find out what he has to say. And he would say, "Now, this scene, this is bullshit." And I said, "Really? Why do you say that?" "Ah, they wouldn't do this." "What would they do?" And he'd say what they did. I said, "Well, here's why we couldn't do that." We had a really good talk. We parted as friends.
Yeah.
It was a very friendly conversation. He said, "Next time you're in Baltimore, come stay at the house." And unfortunately, it was the last time I saw him. He died some years later, and I got to see him again. But we were in touch a little bit. I liked him a lot. He was a tough guy, but he had earned the right to be tough. He was an extraordinary researcher who, in the course of writing these books, had sources that told him stuff that nobody else was able to find out. And he was a meticulous researcher.
You touched on something right back at the start of the story, and I did jump a little bit ahead about you came to this late, which again it isn't usual across the way that your career has run. And I think I can say, without offending you here, I think you came to this. You weren't the first choice. The leading actor had already been cast. I think Mace Newfield, wasn't it, who produced the whole series? He presumably, I think we lost him a few years ago, but he presumably was on board with a very firm idea of what he wanted. Paramount knew what it wanted. And that strikes me as the kind of bonfire I wouldn't have thought a filmmaker like you would walk into.
And I wouldn't think that I'm the kind of filmmaker that they would even open the door for. I mean, I've never done anything remotely like this.
No.
I got a call from my agent one morning late it was like the end of August of 2000. And my agent said, "Listen, Philip Noyce just dropped out of the new Tom Clancy film.
Yeah.
And Paramount is meeting with directors and they want to meet with you." And I said, "Well, that can't be true. There's no way they're going to offer me this film." And he said, "No, they said they want to meet with you." And I said, "Do me a favor, call Mace," because I knew Mace a little bit and he was a real gentleman. It was a wonderful, wonderful man. I said, "Call Mace and find out if this is just a courtesy meeting. They don't have to do this. It's like, don't waste their time, don't waste mine. We'll do something else together."
Yeah.
My agent called me back and said, "No, Mace says they really want to meet with you." Now, I don't know if my agent ever spoke with Mace or not at that point, but they set up a meeting and I went in and I thought, I can't go in and talk about action and visual effects and things that I know nothing about. So I went in and talked about character.
Yeah.
And here's exactly what I said. I said, there's a moment in the first film, with the Hunt for Red October, Alec Baldwin is hanging from a helicopter in a storm in the North Atlantic, slamming up against the conning tower of a submarine, and he says, "I should have written a report."
Yeah.
I said, "That's the guy I want to make a movie about." And they all leaned back and said, "Wow, that's a great idea."
Because at that point, if I've got the history of this right, I mean, Harrison Ford for a while was going to do it. There was a script in place that, as you said, everybody hated. And if everybody had liked that, this would have been running like several months before. So presumably when you walked in, they knew they had to change this as well. It wasn't just bringing in a director. They knew that the screenplay was going to need an overhaul.
The script, they had a very, the original script didn't work at all. And that was a very faithful adaptation of the book.
Yeah.
It was a very good adaptation of the book, but it didn't work as a movie.
Yeah.
A year before I came on, they hired Paul Ananasio, who's a terrific writer.
Yes. Quiz Show.
He did it,
wasn't it?
Quiz Shows, exactly.
One of my favorite films of the 90s, Quiz Show.
A great film.
A great film. Agreed.
He did a very good adaptation that made a lot of changes. But it was still for someone of Harrison Ford's age and stature. So the character was, I think he was deputy director of the CIA or something. And I would say that character is just, I don't relate to that guy anymore. I think Harrison was fabulous in those films, but you move him up in the bureaucracy and I lose interest. So they were already, they already had hired a writer, a terrific writer named Dan Pine, who was going to do the next draft because Paul was working on something else. And when I was talking about character, I said, half of this guy being over his head. He's never done this sort of thing before. I'm thinking of myself at the same time. And they said, well, we've offered it to Ben Affleck, who wants to do it. I said, it's a great idea because he can play that guy who's in over his head. And they said, okay, let us think about this. And my agent called back and said, boy, you hit a home run. They were all raving about the meeting. Sherry, why don't you come in tomorrow and meet with Sherry? So I went in to meet with Sherry, and I walked into her office and I said, are you nuts? Do you want the nice, gentle Tom Clancy film where nothing bad happens and the audience goes out saying, that was sweet? And she laughed and she said, I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want action sequel number 14.
Yeah.
You know, she says, I don't want it to be about explosions and special effects. I want it to be about the characters and the politics and have humor and heart. I said, if you really mean that, I would love to do this.
Yeah.
She said, we really mean it. That's what we want. I want you to do it. It's up to, she says, go to New York tomorrow, meet with Ben. If Ben likes you, you're doing the movie.
Yeah.
And so the next day I flew to New York, met with Ben, who is impossible not to like. He's just the greatest guy.
Yeah.
And we had a wonderful time and a great talk. And he said, let's do it. And a week later, I was on a plane to
Would a
Montreal.
lot of the natural, I don't know, objections or boundaries or things that you push against on a project like this have been ironed out by the fact that you came to the fourth one that they were doing? So they'd run through a lot of the more, I mean, I like the previous films, but they'd run through a lot of the more obvious and they tick the boxes that they needed to tick.
I think that's probably true. And also, Harrison and Philip Noyce had dropped out. And I didn't speak to either one about that. I know them both. I haven't asked either one, why did you drop out? I believe someone told me that one or both of them had objections to the bomb going off and wanted the script rewritten where the bomb doesn't go off.
Yeah.
And that no one could figure out how to make that work in the script. So for whatever reason, one dropped out and the other said, well, he's not in, I'm not in. And it was all, amicable as grown-ups making smart decisions. They said, this isn't right. This particular one is not right for me.
Yeah.
So now it's a wide open field. The script's being rewritten. And they were looking for an actor and a director who could reboot things and start afresh. And I would say, when I met with Ben, I said, this is not number 4 in a series. This is number 1 in a new series. I said, you can't be thinking about how would Harrison play this, and I can't be looking over my shoulder and saying, how would Phil Noyce or McTiernan direct this? I've got to ignore those 3 films that I really love and start afresh.
So did you, I mean, you of course have a long pedigree in writing. You're not credited at the script, but you just hinted just before that you've done a bit of writing on it. Is that one of those instances where you do bits and bobs and you just don't get the credit on it? Yeah.
Yeah, I had Dan Pine was writing this new draft, and basically it said to me, tell me what you want. I know what the studio wants. Tell me what you want. And we were at a real meeting of the minds. He's a lovely guy and a really good writer. And we sort of outlined what we wanted to do. And then I said to him, would you mind? I said, it's part of my deal. I said, would you mind if I took some of these scenes? And he said, absolutely. Which ones do you want? And I said, I'll take this one, this one, this one. And he took the rest. He did much more writing than I did. But I wrote a bunch and things that I thought I can really nail this. I think I know exactly how to do this. Dressler's speech, for instance, was actually things that I had been thinking about for years.
Yeah.
The notion that the 20th century is not the story of capitalism versus communism. It's about fascism.
Yeah.
And that the virus is now airborne. That was all stuff I've been saying for a long time, and there was this character who was the perfect conduit for those thoughts.
Quite a character as well, right?
So we had a wonderful time, and one of the things I just loved, was I'd be on the set and I'd have an idea, and I would email Dan and say, "I'm shooting this tomorrow. Would you please sit up all night and do this? I'm going to go to bed." And it was wonderful.
So, I mean, at what point did you come on board? How long did you have to shape this into a film before you were shooting the first scene?
I came on in September of 2000. We started shooting in February.
I was going to cry.
February of 2000. Yeah, it was fast. I mean, we immediately started to prep.
Yeah.
And they said, you're shooting in Montreal. And I went to Montreal and I was there for probably about a week scouting and whatnot. And I came back and I said to the head of production of the studio, well, why are we shooting in Montreal? There's no locations that are appropriate. And he said, well, all those European looking streets in Montreal. I said, what scenes in this movie have European-looking streets?
Yeah.
It turns out that they had booked the stages and the offices for another movie that fell out, and it was a non-refundable deposit. So to save, I don't know, $100,000, they sent an $85 million movie to the wrong city, to a city that was not really set up to be the right place to shoot this. It's a lovely city. I like Montreal very much. I like the people, but this was not an ideal place to shoot this movie.
And the clock was ticking, and your hands were tied to a degree.
Absolutely, we were locked in. We were going there. So we every weekend of this shoot, we scouted.
Yeah.
Every weekend that we were in photography, we were out trying to find the next locations. And the art department had to build sets that you wouldn't know. They had to build hallway sets and office sets, things that you should be able to find that we just couldn't find.
You told me when you were on the plane to the location of Field of Dreams, you had a sinking feeling in your stomach and a feeling of dread about directing, and the self-doubt's absolutely bubbling up. Did you have the time for that this time? With it?
I didn't. And also not being the credited screenwriter, I think freed me up. I remember saying to myself, okay, your job as the director here is not to protect what you wrote. It's to be a director.
Interesting.
And so I approached this in a new way for me, which was, okay, this is all about directing chops and developing them and seeing what you can do and thinking like a director, not like a writer trying to protect his writing.
Because you've been relatively candid in our chats in the past about the actual bit when you're on set isn't the most fun bit, and it's when you're at your most down a lot of the time. I think it was one of your productions, someone went and quietly had a word with you about that, about trying to enjoy it more and just getting a bit more out of it. Were you a bit more, I don't know, were you because you were obviously a bit older when you came to this as well, and the circumstances different. Did that all work in your favor?
I think it did. And I think that, having a little more experience helped. I directed several films at this point and felt like, okay, I'm not going to completely embarrass myself. Although on a picture this big, you still can, if you aim wrong, you can really stub your toe in a big way. I thought I'd be okay. And I was looking forward actually to directing some of these big, as I said to somebody, I'm working with really big toys.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to that. I think it'll be fun. And the cast was spectacular fun.
Well, I want to come to one or two of the character actors shortly on it as well. But I just wonder, just as the human being, because I find this as I get older, that the fear of failure isn't as overwhelming as it once was, that it's still there. But I just wonder if you found the same, that if the worst happened and the film had been a disaster, you'd have still have had breath in your lungs, right?
Yes. I desperately wanted this to be good.
Yeah.
But there was an element of, I didn't feel so precious about it. I felt like I could be a little freer than I had been in the past. And I think that's important for a director. I think it's important for a writer too, when you're writing. But I felt like, I've done a bunch of things that I had no right to think I could pull off, and I did okay on them. So maybe this will be okay. But the trick for me had to be go into it freely and go into it with confidence and don't hold back. Really, it's like you have a big canvas, make a big painting.
You've touched on character a little bit, and this is one of the questions about the sum of all fears I've always wanted to ask you. And we've come to the point where I ask my dim question. I like my dim questions. But whenever I think of films that I really care about, they're rarely about the end of the world. I grew up on things like The Goonies, where the stakes are a bunch of kids trying to save a house, and more recently there's been Captain Underpants, which I think is a masterclass in modern day stakes, which is two kids just don't want to be separated in class, and I care so much about that. And I know I'm not naming Field of Dreams because I'll spoil it if I talk about the stakes in that, but you know my feelings on this. Again, for you, the storyteller, a lot of your storytelling has been on smaller canvases with much more contained stakes. And I just wonder, when you looked at that screenplay and realized you had to make an audience care about the end of the world, which sounds like the most bizarre thing, was there a moment there? I mean, what was the challenge? What was the thing for you?
It's a great question. One of the biggest challenge, I didn't think that there'd be a problem making people care about the end of the world because I thought that the book and the screenplay were quite good, and the story was plausible. And it struck a chord with me that goes back to the 60s. When I read an article, I was in high school. I remember sitting on the couch in our living room, reading an issue of Reader's Digest magazine.
I've heard of it.
In which there was an article positing the following. A nuclear bomb is shipped in a cargo container, comes to the port of New Orleans. It's taken off the ship, put on a truck, and driven into the heartland of America and explodes somewhere, and it will be impossible to ever tell who sent it. And ever since I read that article, I would always tell people, I'm not afraid of an ICBM from the Soviet Union because that has a return address on it.
Yeah.
What scares me is somebody puts a nuclear device in a box and ships it here and puts it and drives it in somewhere and sets it off. There'll be nothing left of that truck. We'll never know who did it. When I read this script, I thought, oh my God, this is this thing I've been talking about for all these years. This is my fear.
There's a little bit of Roald Dahl's writing hut about that. And there's a museum dedicated to Roald Dahl here in the UK, and it has one of his notebooks in there. And I thought it was really interesting. I grew up devouring that man's work, and it's a list of things in his past, a list of ideas, and he wouldn't put them in stories, but he would just list the ideas, and then in a very regimented way, he would tick them off once he'd used them. No, but you saw just like the ingredients of these stories years, possibly even decades before he actually put them to paper.
Where is this museum? I must go.
Oh, well, I'm obviously going to get you to the UK to screen your films as I speak. Buckinghamshire. It's not a massive museum or anything like that, but it's got his writing hut and it's got his wrapped up chocolate bar wrappers, and it talks about this regimented routine of how we write from something like 2 till 6 and 10 till 1, and then he'd have his sandwich, and that was it. That was his time. But it was
I tried to adapt. I tried to get a deal on My Uncle Oswald years ago.
Right. Okay.
Now it couldn't be done now. It's just too politically incorrect. But I love that book. I think it's one of the great sort of just impolite and hilarious books I've ever read.
But it was just that idea. I mean, it doesn't sound like you've got like quite a regimented tick box, but you've got all these loose strands of things in your head. And
we all do.
The bell goes off. Yeah,
we all do. And I think that's when writers get inspired, is when the bell goes off and you say, I wasn't looking to do that.
Yeah.
But there's this thing right in front of me that actually vibrates on the same frequency as this other thing.
Yeah.
That I once thought about. It's sort of like I read an interview with who was it who wrote Taxi Driver?
Paul Schrader.
Paul Schrader. And someone said, did you ever drive a cab? He goes, no. They said, how'd you write that screenplay? He said, I was very lonely at that time, and I wanted to write about loneliness. So I thought, well, what's the loneliest job I can think of? An overnight taxi driver.
Yeah.
And he started to construct a story about that guy that related entirely to him, but there isn't a moment in that film that he ever actually did. You know what I mean? It's like he invented out of whole cloth things that were completely true to him. And I think that's when writers are at their best. And probably directors too.
Is that when it's at the most fun for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Because there's the surprise. You know, if you say to yourself, I'm going to write about something that I went through, I don't think it brings out the best in us because we don't know really how to tell those stories. We've told them to ourselves so many times that they've lost their currency and they've lost their excitement.
Yeah.
Somebody once said, don't write what you know, write what you don't know.
Yeah.
Because it'll make you dig deep. It'll make you explain it'll make you, give you the pressure to convince the audience that this is a good story.
I don't know if you find this. I found there's nothing that flows faster than fiction when you're writing, when you don't have to triple check everything, when you've set out the course that you want to go on and you just go.
Well, that I'm sure that works for you. For me, because I'm so insecure about my fiction abilities that I throw myself into research. It becomes very slow.
Yeah.
You know, if you said to me, write a fictional story about a milkman, I would spend weeks interviewing milkmen and going online and finding out about the kind of vehicles they drive, because I don't have confidence that I can come up with better ideas than the world has in real life.
That's sculpting as much as anything else, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think of myself, I feel like I am a nonfiction writer.
Interesting.
Even when I'm writing fiction.
Are you familiar with John Ronson's work?
No.
So there's he wrote he's written a couple of screenplays, but he also does a lot of podcast documentaries, and he talks about it as sculpting. He goes out and finds the story, and he will travel from the UK to Los Angeles just to get a 45-second audio snippet, because that's all that he'll get out of it. But he knows that the whole thing is enriched by going and getting that 45 seconds.
Well, Freedom Song was exactly that. I spent years gathering the stories of people who'd worked in the civil rights movement in this one small town in a 6-month period in 1961.
Yeah.
And when I had enough of those stories, I felt like, okay, I can write a fictionalized version of this story, because all of this stuff is true.
One of the, moving back to the Sum of All Fears. I apologize. I'm taking on lots of segues here, as I always horribly tend to do. But that contracted preparation time, what footprint did that allow you to put on the ensemble cast of this? Because you said Ben Affleck was in place, but this is a big cast, right? This is one. I don't know if the Sneakers cast came in larger. I don't think so. There's a lot of characters in this.
Tremendous number of characters in this, and we cast the bigger roles. We cast out of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Some of those are people, you know, if you want Morgan Freeman or James Cromwell, you don't have to have a casting session. You simply say, that's the guy, make an offer.
Yeah.
We knew that we would cast several people out of Europe, and so we had European casting people doing that. So we cast a bunch from LA, but then the great majority of the roles, which are smaller roles, we cast in Montreal, and had a lot of wonderful actors that you don't see all the time in American movies. So that was fun for me. And some of them were, I thought most of them were terrific. Almost to a person, in fact, to a person, I would say, the cast was a delight. There was nobody who would step on the set and I would think, oh God, they're here.
Yeah.
Which usually happens on any film. There's like one or two people who are just difficult, or you just don't get along with, and you say, oh, I got to suck it up and deal with this person, but I don't enjoy it. I had a great time with everybody in this movie. They were professional and fun, and they were great at their jobs, and God, it was a delight.
When I went in to see this film in a UK cinema, inevitably, there's a moment very early on where Richard Marner comes on. And Richard Marner, I don't know how familiar you are with UK culture.
I know. What's the line? The show, the Fatigue?
He was known for a very long-running sitcom where he played the colonel in Hello, Hello. And we hadn't seen him. A whole generation hadn't seen him as serious drama.
Meet the Wife? Meet the Wife was...
we just primarily knew him through Hello, Hello, to the point that when he appeared on the cinema screen in the deepest of Birmingham, when this film came out, there was a little bit of a collective, I think we can call it a WTF moment. You know, what's the bloke from Hello, Hello doing who's suddenly the dying president of Russia?
He was wonderful. He had a great Russian accent. We cast him via videotape. You know, he sent us a tape, and he was warm and funny. And the scene where he's being interviewed, it was all ad-libbed. The interviewer, Robert Robinson is his name, who's a Canadian originally. He just interviewed him, and Richard was just great. He was a delight. We had a stunt person do the fall, the heart attack fall backwards, because I didn't want to hurt the man. But he was really fun. I had read up a little bit about him, and someone said, "Oh, Hello, Hello he was a mainstay." So it was fun to meet him and get to know that.
I just loved the idea that these tapes of Hello, Hello were being passed around in Hollywood and just like cast him. I don't care that it was European casting directors that found him now. I'm just going with my LA-based story on it. I think that's far more fun. But in terms of that ensemble coming together, because I read that you've got a little bit of rehearsal time that you managed to build into the schedule, and I wonder, is that something that you personally, because we've not talked about this before, is that something that you tend to insist on? Because I talk to some directors and it's just a luxury that they just don't get.
I try.
Yeah.
The best is the best I've gotten is for a week or sometimes two before you start shooting, you get mornings to rehearse.
Right. Okay.
That's a lot of rehearsal for a movie.
Yeah.
10 half days. On this, I don't think we had that much, but I picked a couple of scenes that I wanted to throw people together.
Yeah.
The first day that I met Morgan Freeman in person was in a rehearsal. I had talked to him on the phone a bunch, where he had said to me, Montreal, it doesn't get cold in Montreal, does it? I said, no, sir, it does not get cold in Montreal. He said, I don't do cold. I said, no, it's very seasonal. Now, let me tell you how cold it is in Montreal. Friends of mine in Toronto were saying, oh my God, you're not going to Montreal, are you? And I thought, great. Canadians are afraid of this place. And we were there in the winter. So I meet Morgan on the set with Ben, and we're going to rehearse scene 42. And I shook his hand and said, hello, nice to meet you. Hi. I said, so Morgan, do you want to start over here? And he said, no. And I said, no. And he said, well, you asked me if I wanted to. I'm telling you, no, I don't. I'll do it if you want me to, but I didn't want to. And I said, oh, okay, I see how this works. So the next time I asked him a question, he did the same joke on me. And I said, you know what? Don't make me get physical with you. And of course, he's twice my height. And he just laughed. He and Ben, both of whom tower over him. They're both 6'3", 6'4". Yeah. They're enormous. And James Cromwell is even bigger. They had the best time together. They were all professionals, and they were in it to do good work, and they enjoyed each other. And the president's advisors, just a great bunch of actors. Ron Rifkin and Philip Baker Hall. And these guys are just great. They're all experienced stage actors.
Yeah.
And I knew that I wanted people who could be part of an ensemble and could work off of each other the way stage actors really can. And that was some of the most fun stuff for me, was the scenes when they're all bouncing off of each other.
There's also I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about the importance of bringing humor into it. And there is a version of this film that could have just been Morgan Freeman and Ben Affleck just riffing for 90 minutes, I reckon.
Yes.
But, I mean, yes. So the first time you met Morgan Freeman and the first time he presumably met Ben Affleck on this project is on the first day of rehearsal. Was that there from the start? Was that just that easy, dry comedy between them?
Yes, it was. They're both very funny.
Yeah.
And there was one day on the set where Ben said to me, Ben and I were just sitting by ourselves, and he started to do an impression of Morgan. And it was a speech that Morgan had in the movie, which one was it? Oh, the World War II, the Civil War, Glory, speech from Glory, in which he says, I know because I dug the graves myself. And Ben did that whole speech for me. And I said, God, that's a great impression of Morgan. He said, I got to tell you, he says, Matt and I, in every script we write, we try to put that line in. We just love that line. We've never found a place for it. And I said, have you done this impression for Morgan? It's great. He goes, no, I couldn't do that. And Morgan was across the stage. I said, hey, Morgan, come here. And Ben's going, no, don't do this to me. Don't do it. I said, no, Morgan, you got to hear this. This guy, he does you better than you. You got to hear this. And Ben's going, don't do it. Morgan comes over. We're both sitting in chairs. Morgan is standing. He's about 18 feet taller than we are. And Ben does his little speech. I know because I dug the graves myself. And Morgan is just folded arms, just looking down at him. And Ben got so uncomfortable, he went right into the next speech, which was a Denzel Washington speech. And Morgan said, now that's a good Denzel.
I mean, the ensemble of this is incredible. But what I also like is it's not just the recognizable names, it's the recognizable faces that you dig into character actors. And the one I wanted to cite is Michael Byrne. In this.
Wonderful Michael Byrne.
Well, he plays Grushkov in the film, for those who know it. But it's just like, I mean this respectfully, it's just like he brings with it a face that instantly looks like it's lived 1,000 lives.
Yes.
And without saying a word, that there's just impact to his presence on there, like proper character actor stuff.
And it's not just, I mean, the face does do that, but another person with less acting skill and the same face couldn't do what he does. He has an enormous amount of stuff going on inside to make that face do that for you. And what I needed in that role was a guy who, without saying very much, could communicate, look at me, keep your eye on me.
Yeah.
Because he says very little, but he's always lurking in the background, and the movie works only if you keep going, who is that guy and what is his story? Because when it's revealed what his story is, it's very satisfying. And it's only because he's so good that it makes it satisfying. He was just tremendous talent, I think.
He also gives you a hell of a final moment as well.
Yes.
Again, I'm not going to spoil that, but yeah, quite a moment. You talked about the cold of Montreal, and those director commentaries that you talked about that nobody listens to, and all of that. Yeah, I've listened to those. And what I got from that, because there's one that you do with your DP, is it John
Lindley?
John Lindley.
Yes.
And what I hadn't appreciated on the Summer of All Fears, when it actually came to the physical production of it, you had the absolute extreme of weathers. That he talked in there. I think he talked on the commentary about camera equipment melting in extreme heat. And then the absolute opposite extreme, presumably just a few weeks later, when you're in blisteringly cold weather as well. And can you talk to the challenge and just the variation of that? I mean, you're the guy who previously grew a nice looking cornfield, right? Or, was shooting primarily on sound stages or a bit of location around cities and stuff like that. This felt quite extreme.
It was very extreme. We went from, there was one day in Montreal when it was 25 below zero. And there was a day in the desert when it was 130 above. So we think we may have set the record. And of course, this is because we shot in Montreal in the winter and in Death Valley in the summer. I kept saying to the production manager who made the schedule, why don't we shoot Death Valley in the winter and Montreal in the summer? Well, there were a lot of reasons, but things couldn't come together. Casting availabilities and stages and whatnot. We had to do it this way, and it was kind of a nightmare. The cold was so cold. When I got to Montreal, I knew enough to do this. I found some of the local crew, some of the guys like the grips and electricians, people who stand outside at night a lot. And I said to them, take me to the wilderness store and tell me what to buy. And so these guys said, you need these kinds of boots and these kinds of socks and this kind of thermal underwear and these kind of layers. And there was one night in Montreal when I had every layer of clothing on that I had, and I was still cold, and we were indoors. We were in an abandoned factory, which had no heat, and it was cold, and it was wet. And I've never been so cold in my life. And there was nothing more I could do.
Good grief. Good grief.
And then at the end of the schedule, we were in the desert, and two Panavision cameras melted. We had 3 Panavision bodies with us. 2 of them melted.
I mean, just to throw more fresh itches that you were scratching here as well. This was a film too where not all of your shots you could capture in camera.
Right. There was a lot of CGI.
Yeah, and I just wonder. I just wonder I mean, partly in comparison to the films that you made before, but you've usually got to an edit room, and you've talked briefly about this before, and you get an assembly that you generally don't like, but it's all of the shots. At least you've got them all there. But presumably with this one, it's just like your shots were coming complete quite late in the process, and I just wonder how your style adapted to that and how you found that.
I found it challenging. I had no choice, so I just had to live with it. There's not that much of the film that was visual effect if you look at the number of minutes. But those minutes were almost fully impacted by visual effects. So there were swaths of the film where you're just looking at a slug on the screen that says, a visual effects here. So that's a challenge. It's hard to know how to time those things. We had a great visual effects team who were just churning stuff out every day we'd get like another shot and another piece of another shot. It was difficult in our early test screenings. The audiences had to look at really incomplete work. There were scenes that said bomb explosion here, you know. But what's interesting is audiences can do it.
Yeah,
they can make that leap. But there was a lot of visual effects that I'd never done. There was a lot of action scenes I'd never done before, and so you surround yourself with people who know how to do that stuff. And we had a great second unit director, a great action coordinator, who really helped shape a lot of that stuff.
I mean, it's one of the things that comes through on the commentary track is how many, like, small to my eyes, visual effects there are. Just shots you wouldn't necessarily feel need them.
Right.
But then presumably you're not getting that fully packaged until quite late in the process, whereas ordinarily you're used to dealing with completed footage there. So it was
Right.
almost Forrest Gump special effects, I call them, when I see them like that. I mean, you hinted too, because the thing that we've not talked about is this could have been studio product as well. There's a version of this that's, I mean, it franchise film. I'm looking at a DVD box set of it here, all packaged nicely together. And you've talked about, I mean, you hinted just before, without going stirry or anything like that, about there were difficulties on the production of this, that there were disagreements and there were arguments. But I just wonder, was there, because you made, I've got a sentence that I wrote here, that the film at its heart, a lot of the time for me, is huge decisions made by people struggling in underwhelming rooms. And boring corridors, and that's kind of what makes it work so much. But that's not, to me, to my eyes, a big studio blockbuster. And I just wonder if there was any kind of conflict there once the footage started going back.
There wasn't a conflict. That was actually, you're so right. That was a discussion at the very beginning of the process, and that's when Sherry Lansing said to me, "I don't want this to be, you know, just another action sequel. I want it to be about the politics and the characters." She meant it, and I took her at her word, and that's the film I made. And I know there were some fans of the book who were unhappy that we took that route. They would have liked to have seen more hardware and whatnot. I think that it was the right decision to make. It certainly was the right decision for me. I don't think I would know how to do the other version. And the cast was certainly on board. The only disagreement I ever had with the studio was the first time we meet Dressler. He's giving a speech to a group of people. We don't know who they are.
Is this The Watch?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's giving this speech, and I wanted that scene to be mysterious. It's like, I want him to seem like a good guy, that he says nothing in this speech that paints him as a dangerous, evil villain. We should wonder, who is this guy?
Yeah.
When Sherry read that draft, she said, "You've got to, in this scene, you've got to establish he's the villain." And I said, "Oh, I love the fact that we don't." She said, "I really need you to do that. Just this kind of film, it needs to establish who the villain is." She said, "He's got to say something terrible." I said, "How about instead of saying something terrible, we let him finish his speech, and then the camera moves down to his watch, and we see that a faded out inscription on the inside of his watch. It's a swastika." And she said, "Great." And I suggested that, knowing that I could cut that out, that I could shoot the scene the way I wanted and then not use the swastika.
Yeah.
So we shot the scene, we shot the swastika. I cut this thing together, and Sherry saw this film for the first time about a year after we had that discussion. And the first thing she said to me was, "Where's the swastika?" She did not forget. She's a very smart lady. She's very sharp. She knows what she wants. And one of the things I loved about working for her is you never had to guess what she wants.
Yeah.
I've had other situations at other studios where you need to read rabbit entrails to understand what they want. She's very clear. Give me this, give me that, give me that. Don't do this, do that. Great. That's all I ask, is be clear.
I touched on rehearsals just before, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up was you've got a couple of key scenes in this film, which are, I mean, basically that they're just people sat down. Lots of people in a room sat down. They're not even stood up and moving around the room. I remember that moment in Sneakers where the camera kind of goes off one way and then goes the other while people are standing around. And so you've got some form in this department. But it's the camera that's doing the work there. in those sequences. I was watching it just before that we came on again, but I'm just I'm just trying to balance that with just this very, very small amount of prep time. And I'm just wondering how much of this is instinct, how much is planning, how much is experience.
You try to plan everything.
Yeah.
I mean, literally everything. Experience teaches you that you can't.
Yeah.
And also that you need to leave yourself open to those happy accidents that occur when you're setting the scene up and something isn't working and you go, wow, it'd be cool if we did that. I'll give you an example. When the president and his advisors run onto the plane after the bomb goes up, they run onto the plane.
Yeah.
And I thought, and there was dialogue for them to all say. And I thought, the thing I don't want them walking onto the plane in a set order and doing their lines in a set order.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that in this situation, it's just chaos, that nobody knows what's going on and they're all just bouncing off the walls. So to shoot this, I said to the cast, I'm not going to tell you what order to come onto the plane.
Yeah.
Just come on, however you come on. And I'm not going to tell you where to stand. And I'm not going to tell you even when to say your line. Say your line when you feel like it. And if someone else is talking, talk over them.
Yeah.
And then I said, we had 2 or 3 cameras in the plane for that scene. And I said to the camera operators, you're not going to see a rehearsal. I'm just giving you assignments. You cover this guy, and then pan off to that guy at this point. And just if another camera's in your shot, just pan off him. I wanted chaos.
Yeah.
And boy, we got it. People were talking over each other. It was great.
You'd also done the thing earlier in the film, though, of course, of showing us how it's supposed to work. You've showed us that you showed us that sequence, which I just want. I remember watching it. I wonder if that was one of the screenplay eureka moments, that basically you foretold the whole thing, how it's supposed to run, aside from a phone call coming in, and then when it actually happens and you see all these people you assume to be competent, who know what they're doing, are actually just thrown into chaos.
Exactly. Show how it's supposed to be, and then that means you have to show how it really is, and it's got to be completely different.
Yeah.
And so the camera operators didn't know what was happening. The actors didn't know what was happening. In the first take, Ron Rifkin couldn't get his chair to open up. He's supposed to sit on it, and he just said, I can't get this goddamn chair to work. I said, keep that in. And so every take after that, he would do that. Because to me, it was the perfect example of things don't work right, and you're at your wit's end, and you're just bouncing off the walls. My
favorite scene also has a lot of people in it, and it's the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And it's a beautiful moment of, you don't need dialogue to tell us the power dynamics in a room. And for those who haven't seen it, it's a room where lots of important people, all dressed up to the nine, are sat in a room with the President of the United States doing quite a funny speech, to be fair. 52 electoral vote. Yeah. Was that yours?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I had actually written that as a placeholder, and I had contacted a guy who used to write comedy for the president.
Yeah.
And I said to him, give me something like this, and he said, well, just use that.
52 electoral votes. That's
yeah.
But the beauty of it is all the pages going. Well, no, it's not all the pages going off. It's half the pages going off.
That's right.
And you told me before that the scene wasn't originally intended to be about who didn't get the call, but then it became who didn't get the call. Was that an on-set? Was that a kind of moment that you realized when you were shooting?
Yes. When we're shooting, we shot the audience first, because I didn't want them to get tired by a whole day of shooting. And as we were shooting, when the pagers go off, we had everybody whose pagers go off, and they're extras. They act like, I must take this important page, and they stalk off. And I thought, I find myself, as we're shooting this, not looking at them. I'm looking at these people who are sitting at the table looking around like, what the hell's going on? And I thought, that's more interesting. And so we added some of those. So we made sure we had enough of that to cut. Because I thought, in those moments, I'm less interested in the important people. The movie's not about them. The movie's about everybody else who's sort of left behind or who becomes victims to this.
Yeah.
And that was interesting to me.
Can you go that level of, and do you go that level of tunnel vision once the camera's on, once you've called action? Is it you can zone absolutely everything out and just spot spot that going on in front of you.
Absolutely. In fact, for every film I've done, for a good couple of years after the film is done,
yeah,
when I look at every scene, I remember what side of the camera I was standing on. I remember exactly where I was when we shot that shot. And I remember what happened before that shot and after that shot. And it takes a couple of years. And now I can look at the films and I don't think about that. I can't even remember where I was most of the time.
Yeah.
You know, was I close? Was I far? Was I next to the left side, the right side? What was happening? It takes a long time for that stuff to go out of your mind. But when you're shooting, your job is to be just laser focused on every possibility and to see things. There's a scene early in the film when Ben and Bridget Moynihan are in bed, and we had done a take where the camera's on a two-shot on their faces, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that their feet were sticking out of the sheets at the bottom of the bed.
This
and
is
they
the
were
fruity bit at the start, isn't it, Phil Alden Robinson?
Yeah,
you're taking us down a very saucy route here.
It was. And I noticed their feet were they were playing footsie. And during the take, I nudged John Lindley and I just sort of looked over at the feet and he nodded. And we made a note we're going to get a shot of their feet doing this. And afterwards, Bridget said to me, when she saw the film, she said, I love the film and I'm so happy that you got my best feature.
Bridget Moynihan's really good in this film as well. She's really good.
She's great. She's great.
There was one of my favorite bits of movie trivia surrounds the film Police Academy Mission to Moscow, because I didn't appreciate that was the first Hollywood production that was allowed to film in Moscow. After
really?
There are bullet holes in the background of that film because there was an uprising against Boris Yeltsin while the cast was there.
Wow.
I'm not going to take a bullet for the film Police Academy Mission to Moscow, but that's its place in cinema history.
Wow.
There's a moment on one of the commentary tracks where, because you got second unit into Moscow for this, and you talk about
inside the Kremlin.
Can you take that story on, because you obviously weren't there for the second unit, but you sounded very surprised at the amount of footage that your team was able to get.
Yeah, we hired a wonderful second unit director who had worked in Europe a lot and had long talks with him about what we needed. We had gotten permission to shoot on the grounds of the Kremlin.
Yeah.
And so I said, I just need to see the motorcade coming in and some shots of the city and whatnot. He was really creative, and he got, when we saw what he'd shot, there's a great shot of a young Russian soldier standing guard as the motorcade goes by, a shot of this kid standing guard. And I was so moved by that, and I thought, that's a director with a really great eye to find that detail.
And was this Christopher Woods? Was that?
I believe it was, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking it up as we talk, just because I love naming people who've gone on and done extraordinary work like that. But that was, I hadn't appreciated quite what a thing that was to get all of that material, certainly inside the Kremlin.
It's quite difficult, and it could have been revoked at any moment. So he was on sort of shaky ground all the time he was there. He had to make sure that he never stepped across the street when he wasn't supposed to step across the street, that kind of thing. And he was able to just shoot and not offend anybody, and got in and out and just did a great job.
I think you've told me before that the original production schedule of Field of Dreams, for instance, was slightly delayed, although I think you could blame the weather and crops and things for that. But on this one, were the deadlines a bit harder? Did you manage to get it in the can on time? Was it all done and dusted in and around?
It did. We came in pretty close to schedule. When I was hired, which is September of 2000, the studio told me, this is scheduled to be released in the summer of 2002, unless you could tell us that you think you could have it ready by Christmas 2001. And I said, I can't. And I said that on the basis of the fact that I'd never done something with so many visual effects, and I figured post-production was going to be slower than someone who's more experienced in that stuff would have. So when we wrapped in June or July of 2001, So I knew at that point it was a year before we were going to be released. And so post-production it didn't feel like, oh boy, we got to really rush. We did work quickly because there was so much to do.
Yeah.
And then we were interrupted by September 11th, and we actually shut down for a couple of weeks. But it didn't affect the release schedule.
The bit I've saved asking until this point is the did they really just do that moment in the film, which is, I'm going spoilery here for anyone who's not seen it. I'll leave a pause. That you in a film that's got a lot of non-traditional choices, a relatively end quiet for a while, a lead character who just doesn't have the power, even in his own home, he's just not got the power. And moments where you're holding scenes for, it feels like, as long as you can possibly get away with, rather than do lots of quick cuts and moving it along. The bomb, the positioning of the explosion of the bomb in the movie, which is what, about 1 hour 10 minutes into a 2-hour film, was that always so? Was it always there?
Yes, it was always there. And to me, that was one of the great brave decisions that Clancy and the screenwriters and the studio all converged on, which is, in this movie, the hero doesn't say, wait, it's the red wire or the green wire, quick, make a decision, and he cuts the correct wire.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in this film. The bomb goes off. That never happens to a movie with a hero.
Yeah.
And that's what I liked about it. I thought, this is what could happen in real life. And so there were a lot of decisions. It was probably the most amount of thought went into, how do we show the bomb going off?
Yeah.
We do that sequence. And the first, I knew what I didn't want before I knew what I wanted.
Yeah.
I knew I didn't want wide shot of the city and a big blinding light and then a mushroom cloud. It's boring. It's obvious. It's also, this is Hollywood. We could make that look really cool. And the audience would be saying, wow, you got to see the scene where the bomb goes off. And that's not what I wanted the audience to feel. I wanted them to feel gut punched at this moment.
Well, the fact that this is an audio and a podcast means that listeners can't see that Michael Bay is now in the background of your shot, just glaring at you heavily into the back of your head.
I also felt that would be a dishonest point of view. If you could see that, you'd be blind or dead.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, there's got to be a different way to do this. And I had a dream, actually. And in a dream, I was in a hotel room in Seattle, Washington, looking out across Puget Sound. Yeah. And there are islands in Puget Sound. And in my dream, I'm looking out at the window, one of these islands, and a nuclear bomb goes off, and there's a mushroom cloud. And in the dream, I, or the character that I was in that dream, went, oh no, oh no, oh no, we can't take that back. This changes everything.
Yeah.
And I felt sick to my stomach in the dream. And when I woke up, I thought, wow, that's what I want that moment to feel like. I want people to feel like, oh no, this changes everything, and to feel sick to their stomach. And I'll get to this changes everything in a minute, because that affected how we shot it. But so I started looking at all the photographic material about nuclear bombs going off. There's footage, stills and movie footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's a lot of movie footage that the Army shot, or the government shot, of atomic tests in the American West. The most impressive shots are not the bomb goes off. The most impressive shots are 2 miles away, when you see a stand of trees get knocked over by the shockwave. The most impressive shots in Nagasaki and Hiroshima are not at ground zero. It's 2 miles away, where houses are just matchsticks because the heat burned them from miles away. And I thought, that's what we don't want to see the effect of the bomb on the dead. We want to see the effect of the bomb on survivors.
Yeah.
And hey, we've got a bunch. We've got Jack, we've got his girlfriend, we've got the president, we've got the CIA head. Let's follow them through this moment.
And you're talking,
and then each one of those,
as impactful. That
yes,
yeah,
right. And each of those moments had to be shot in a very different way, and required a tremendous amount of discussion about what's visual effects, what's this, what's that. But the really interesting discussion was when I said to John Lindley, when the bomb goes off, this changes everything. It's changed. The world is different. And I think that the world should look different. And he said, what do you have in mind? And I said, I think the air looks different. And he laughed because we have this, he always says to me, you can't light air. So I said, the air looks different, knowing that that's impossible. And he said, okay, that's a challenge. Let me work on it. And he did a whole bunch of tests and came back to me and said, there's a process called bleach bypass that may give you the look you like. He says, when you develop film and when you print from film, there's a process where they have to run it through a bleach to get all the excess silver halide crystals off. If you don't run it through the bleach, you get something that looks kind of different. It's higher contrast. The colors are less saturated. It's very hard to describe. He showed me a bunch of tests. He shot interiors, exteriors, night, day. And I said, wow, that looks great. That's exactly what I want it to look like. You don't know what the difference is, but it feels like the air looks different. And he said, okay, we can do it to the negative or we can do it to the print. And here's 2 tests to show you the difference. I said, wow, it looks much better on the negative. He said, okay, but understand that you can't predict what it's going to do at any given shot. And if you do it to the negative, you're stuck. And I said, but it looks so much better. Let's just do it. And he said, well, whose permission do we have to ask? I said, we're not asking permission. Nobody will give us permission to do that. So we did it. Once the bomb goes off, all the exteriors in Baltimore are shot with bleach bypass, and they looked great. And one day, the lab screwed up the work print, and they had to reprint it. And they send a report to the studio saying, we have to reprint this bleach bypass shot. And the head of post-production of the studio went bananas. And he called Mace Neufeld in Montreal and said, you can't do this. What are you doing? Whose permission? I never gave permission for this. And Mace said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, talk to John Lindley. So the guy calls John, who is one of the great people on the planet, one of the great negotiators of all time. And the guy goes, he said, you're fucking with my negative. And John said, you know, everything I do is fucking with your negative. And he said, well, don't do it again. I said, well, we have to. Then he called me and I said, we've started this sequence. We have to complete the sequence with the same process. He said, well, don't do it to any other sequences. I said, okay.
And was there any of the variable erraticism that he'd warned you about when it came out?
Well, no, we lucked out. It came out great, just great. We were really happy with it. And it's not something that most people will say, hey, this looks different, but you feel it. You feel it's different.
That's really
And I was very pleased that the sequence did make people feel gut punched and sick to their stomach. The very first test screening we had, the audience got really quiet and they stayed quiet through the rest of the movie. And when the lights came up and the people are filling out their cards, the studio people and I go into another room and they all said, you know, I think when the bomb goes off, it sort of threw people and we're not sure that they really stayed. When we talked to the focus group, they said we couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
That moment, we just couldn't breathe. It had the effect we wanted. And for the rest of the movie, they were just on the edge of their seats.
Well, for a film about nuclear war, it had been quite light to that point as well. And I every time I rewatch it, I forget how funny the first, for the bit with Morgan Freeman and Ben Affleck on the plane, calling his other half, which again, I don't want to spoil. But all that just almost felt wiped from my memory once I'd seen that bit. That's why I was asking, was it always at 1 hour 10 minutes? Was there ever let's move it 10 minutes that way, 10 minutes that way? Did you do any test or alteration on that at all?
No, it was always where it was.
Yeah.
That scene on the plane, by the way, as I recall, I ad-libbed that in my first meeting with the studio.
Yeah.
I said, and I sort of came up with that as a joke, which they liked. But the moment where they first meet, where Ben and Morgan first meet, and Ben has been, rushed to work. He doesn't have a tie on. And Morgan says, what is this, the paper chase? That was a Dan Pine line. And the editor, Neil Travis, told me that day at Dailies, he said, this is going to be a great film. I said, why do you say that? He said, that line. He said, that is so, it's funny and it's real and it's character-based. And I love these two guys. And he says, he said, that moment convinced me that this film's going to be great.
So when you did Field of Dreams, you told me it was James Horner coming in from watching the first work print of it, where you knew that it was going to work. Was that a kind of equivalent moment?
That was one of them. Another was I invited some friends to see a rough cut, and my friend Nick Kazan, who's just a great screenwriter and a wonderful director. He was so uncomfortable that when the film ended, he said, "I'm sorry, I have to leave." He said, and he called me later and he said, I apologize for not talking to you. He said, but the reason I was doing that Saint Vitus's dance in my seat was this film just was so real and so disturbing to me. And I thought, wow, that's impressive. He was really thrown by it. It was my fear was that my sensibility would ameliorate everything and not go for the jugular. And he felt it hit its target dead on.
Can I just, as an aside, in the midst of all of this, thank you for not including the scene where everyone jumps up and applauds when the day is saved, which is one of my movie pet hates. That they jump up and they celebrate. Hundreds of people died just like an hour or two ago, but don't worry because we've got the bad guy kind of thing. Was that? I presume that's a deliberate choice.
Oh yes. It wasn't in any script, but I mean, I always feel like the small moments are what you want there.
Yeah.
You want people sitting on a picnic, having a picnic.
The ending of the film that you chose, which I understand wasn't altered at all by test screens, there were no pickups or anything that were done, was a little bit of that just to release some of the tension that had built up, that you wanted to end it like.
Yes, and also to reward. I believe you should reward an audience for putting up with the tough stuff.
Yeah.
Don't punish them. You're going to punish them by watching some of this stuff. Give them a little reward for having watched it and make it an honest one. There's nothing cheeseball or fake or cutesy about it. It's real.
You get James L. Jones in to ask them what they all wanted again. I like that.
Well, but he died in the last film.
That's a spoiler. That's a spoiler.
Admiral Greer, previous film.
Yes. Hang on, but in the chronology of this, he surely would have been alive.
Oh, that's right. He would have been alive if we were following. If we were number 4, but we were number 1 or A1. Speaking of Horner, he had done the previous 2 Jack Ryan films, and he had done my previous films. And we talked about this, and we couldn't make the schedules work.
Was that what it was?
He was booked solid through the end of that year, and I was planning to score towards the end of 2001. Well, 9/11 events delayed everything, so we wound up scoring at the beginning of the following year. So we could have, but we didn't know that at the time. So in the summer, when I came back from shooting and I had to pick a composer, James was definitely not available, and so I thought Jerry Goldsmith. He's the greatest.
Not a bad name to pull off the bench, is it?
Oh my God. The greatest, and a great man in addition to being a great composer.
I appreciate it. I'm running quite tight on time, but I do want to get to this if this is all right. If there's a bit of the Sum of All Fears that took a little bit of the air out of it, the film that you made, let me just say, wasn't particularly reflected by the poster that came out and the trailer that came out. I mean, I'm only glad I didn't see the trailer before I watched the film, and I think I'm in the minority there. But that, I mean, I wouldn't say it rips the heart out of the film, but it rips a lot of impact out of it, and I can't imagine you were best pleased with that.
I was so upset. I begged them, please don't show the explosion. Please, I'm begging. And they said, well, they compromised. They said, we won't say it's a nuclear explosion. I was just very unhappy.
Yeah.
And the poster I just thought was an angry war movie poster. And they said, no, we find that this appeals to women too. I said, really? I don't know any woman who's going to like this poster. So I lost those arguments. You generally don't win those arguments. It performed very well at the box office. I can't complain with how they released the film, but man, I wish the trailer and the poster had been different. I really do.
So apart from Elena Rishkov from Sneakers popping up in there, I spotted that. What have we all missed from the Sum of All Fears? What don't you get asked about it?
That's a great question. Let me think. Let me take a second and think about that.
Yeah.
Well, the very opening, where the bomb is being loaded onto an Israeli jet. In the script it says a bomb is put on this jet, and we found a location in the California desert. It's a former Air Force base, and they had a hangar.
Yeah.
And at the back of the hangar was this long tunnel that I think was used for exhaust tests or something like that. And when John and I looked at that, we thought, how could we use that? And we thought, what if we started the bomb, which is being wheeled out on this device, what if we started that back in the tunnel? So it's complete, just pitch darkness, and you can't see anything. And then the tunnel door opens, and we emerge into this hangar. And then the hangar doors open, we come outside to the jet. So it was like birth. It was like a scene of birth. And that actually played into something that happened on September 11th. We had just started our first mix for a temporary mix to show to the studio. We started on Monday, September 10th. We had one more day of the mix, and the morning of September 11th, we woke up to this horror in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. And I thought, the opening scene in the movie, which has action music in it, we had found some temporary action music. It's wrong. This scene is it is birth. It's the prologue to a tragedy, and the music should reflect that. And so I hunted around in my house, and I found a piece of music that was like an elegy, and I put that over it.
Yeah.
So that action sequence has very unaction-like music on it, because I realized my initial instinct, which is this is about birth, the birth of the story. It's the birth of a tragedy, and that was the second piece of it. Came to me on September 11th. Really, the only change we made in the movie as a result of September 11th was change the music in that opening. And when I played it for Jerry Goldsmith, he loved it and said that gives me a great idea. He wrote a magnificent piece of music for that. So I was always very proud of that opening because I thought it was really unusual, and it came out of very organic things.
Yeah. Two things kind of spring to mind off the back of that. One was the opening of Lord of War, which kind of did a mild mirror, really, of just having an armament coming through a process, really, albeit with a different intention and a different endpoint to what you were looking for. But also, there's a little bit of Henry Hill in Goodfellas getting to his table at the front of the club. The sheer amount of moving, because I rewatched that sequence 3 or 4 times just before coming on. The sheer amount of moving parts in that. That's a long shot, right? And there's a lot of extras moving, and there's a lot of hardware moving.
And actually, it changed as we were shooting it. We had in the hangar a lot of extras moving through, and I thought, let's lose all the extras. Let's have no person in this shot, because I wanted to feel it's a very unreal shot, actually.
Yeah.
It's not how it would look in real life, but it had a feel. It had there's nothing human about this bomb, so let's take the people out. And the camera was attached to the dolly that the bomb was being moved out on. And at a certain point, it was a steady cam riding the back of this thing. So we're riding with the bomb. When the hangar doors open and we go outside and there's all these people and the plane and everything, the camera actually separates from the bomb.
Yeah.
So in this one shot that we've been riding out the bomb, all of a sudden they're separated. We see the bomb move away from us and go out underneath the plane and get loaded onto the plane. So it was a tricky bit of timing for the camera operator to figure out exactly how to work that. So we just turned to him and we said, you work this out.
Yeah.
How you're going to step off this thing and not show that you're stepping off this thing, but while we're setting everything else up. And Doc, the operator, spent a long time making that work, and I think he did a great job with that.
As always, I've run horribly over and really taken advantage of your time, for which I apologise as always. But I just wonder, I mean, if I can just ask you this: when you look back on this now, how do you reflect on it? How do you feel about the Sum of All Fears now that there's all this distance behind it? And also, I mean, there are moments that perhaps have resonated over time. I think I can gently put that as well.
Well, that's part of what resonates, and I'm very proud of it. I like the fact that I did something I'd never done before, and made a lot of good friends and had a good time doing it, and was proud of the final product. We all were very proud of it.
Yeah.
But we took a lot of criticism at the time for making the villains neo-Nazis.
I remember that.
And I do think that history has proven us right.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the criticism was actually based on misassumptions. People would say, in the book, the villains were Arabs, and for political correctness, they turned them into neo-Nazis. Well, in the book, the villains are not Arabs. They are a combination of Arabs and German radicals and the Native American escaped convict. It's a very complicated conspiracy among these different groups that Clancy needed, because just a bunch of Arabs could not have pulled off the plot that he wrote. He needed these other people involved. And it took him, I don't know, 80 or 100 pages to explain who these people are, how they got radicalized, how they came together, how they worked together. We didn't have room for any of that. We needed shorthand villains, because the movie is not about who the villains are. The movie is about how do you respond to an act of terrorism like this. You could make the villains Santa's elves and it wouldn't change the plot of the movie. So at the time, there was a nascent neo-Nazi movement in Europe. There was this guy named Haider in Austria who was coming to prominence there. We had just read about Kurt Waldheim's Nazi past. Neo-Nazis in Europe were becoming a thing. In the script that I was given, the Adanasio script, the villains were American neo-Nazis. That change was made a year before I came on the film.
Yeah.
And all I did was say, let's not make them American, let's make them European, because I think if your goal is to have Russia and the US get into a nuclear war, you don't want to be living in America.
Yeah.
I thought it was more realistic that it was European.
And does that criticism just sting a little bit still after all this time, or does it kind of dissipate?
It stung because it was repeated, and it was erroneous.
Yeah.
People would say, "Oh, Phil changed it because political correctness." Well, I didn't change it. It would happen a year before I came on, and B, there were very good story reasons for changing this. It wouldn't have worked with just a bunch of Arabs. This is before Al-Qaeda, before we knew about Al-Qaeda. To have a bunch of Palestinians who had no reach into Europe or America, they couldn't have pulled the plot off. We needed something else. So I'm glad we did the change we made, and I'm sorry that it's turned out to be prescient, but we are living in an age where the virus of fascism and neo-Nazism is on the ascension all over the world, in places where it shouldn't be.
I think to follow the lead set by your movie, we need to end a little bit lighter than that.
Okay.
And we need to have the letting a little bit of the air out of the.
I agree.
I mean, briefly, if you can give us a taster, and hopefully we can have another chat in the future on this. What happened next? What was the immediate aftermath of that? If you took a year off after Sneakers, what do you do after you've made a box office franchise hit for a major studio?
Well, at that time, Sherry Lansing was already trying to convince me and Ben to do the next one.
Yeah.
Because that was her hope, that this would be a new franchise. Ben said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "I don't like repeating myself. I've never done it. And I get bored repeating myself. So I'm not really inclined to do it." I said, I would encourage you to do it if you want to, but it's not really what I want to do. I just did one of these. I want to do something completely different. And he said, well, and I don't want to say that his feeling was, if you don't do it, I won't do it. But I think that if I had said yes, I think he might have said yes. Around that time, I ran into Mike Ovitz, who was then Tom Clancy's manager. And Mike said to me, "What's this I hear you don't want to do the sequel?" I said, "Yeah, I just did one. I want to do something different." And he said to me, "Phil, a Brinks truck will back up to your house. More money than you've ever seen will be poured onto your front lawn." I said, "That's very nice, but I want to do something different." So those discussions, and they did keep trying for a while, but then they took me at my word. And I had other things I wanted to do. And actually, I was still operating under the assumption that Hollywood worked the way it had worked up to that point, which is one for you, one for me.
Yeah.
Up to that point, if you do a big studio film that's one of their franchises, they would say, "Okay, what do you want to do next?"
Yeah.
I didn't know that the rules had changed. And so at that point, I kept trying to do the one for me, and they didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to do it. They just wanted to keep making those.
James Mangold is the only person I can think of in the last 10 years who's pulled that off. That he used the one for him to get Le Mans 66. I think it was Ford v Ferrari over there. But even then, that was what, 100 million level. But that was the only way he could get it, because he'd do a Wolverine film.
Right.
Well, that's what you should have done. You should have done a Wolverine film.
I should have done a Wolverine.
Answer. There you go.
Had I known,
then all of your dream projects would have come true.
That's right.
As always, I thank you so much for your generosity of time and for letting me hideously overrun. And as always, I've only got through half my questions and didn't even mention the fact that you've got Antiques Roadshow into a major Hollywood movie as well.
By the way, a show that I dearly love. And I thought it was the perfect, something I always have in my films. I always have like a scene on a television that sort of reflects what's going on. And I thought, boy, Antiques Roadshow was just perfect for this. And I don't recall, that might have been in the script. I don't know that I came up with that idea. I think it might have been in the script. But what I do know is I sat down and looked at a lot of Antique Roadshows to find just the right moment. And when he says, I think it's quite a interesting little find you have there. I thought, yeah, that's what I want.
I'm going to send you a lot of DVDs and VHSs of old British TV shows for your next production as soon as
Why not? Why not?
Phil Alden Robinson, thank you so much for your time.
Simon, you're very welcome as always.
And that brings to an end my conversation with Phil Alden Robinson. I'm hugely, hugely grateful for the amount of time he spared me to discuss this film. Hopefully I can lure him to the UK for some special screenings soon. It also brings to an end to the final episode of the Film Stories podcast for 2022. Ordinarily I give you a big long list of links and ways you can support this podcast at the end of an episode. I just want to say this though, just a huge thank you for continuing to support this independent podcast and for giving it your time. I'm going to continue it right through 2023. I've got a huge amount of films I want to cover, but the most important thing, I say this at the end every time, but I really do mean it, is you all take care, you all be well. I hope there are smiles and light for you in the weeks and months ahead, and in the dark times. I mean, thankfully we have the movies. I know they've helped me enormously through some very difficult times. I hope your dark times are brief and that happy times are closer. With that, I'm going to sign off for the year. Film Stories will return in 2023. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Take care. See you then. I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Take care.